A black mother and her son walked into a diner expecting a quiet meal, but what they got instead was humiliation. The clerk refused to serve them, making cruel remarks and reminding them they didn't belong there. What the clerk didn't realize was who the son really was, and when the truth came out, it left him utterly speechless. Subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're watching from, because this story proves that karma always finds a way to strike back. It was a hot summer afternoon in a small, bustling town in Georgia. The streets were lively with the hum of activity, people running errands, kids chasing each other on bicycles, and the occasional tourist stopping to take in the charming, old-fashioned feel of the place. At the heart of the town stood Mel's Diner, a local institution that had been around for decades. Its red and white sign buzzed faintly, and the smell of frying bacon and fresh coffee wafted out every time the door swung open. Inside, the diner was just as lively. Booths were filled with families and friends enjoying their meals, and waitstaff bustled back and forth, balancing plates of pancakes, burgers, and milkshakes. Behind the counter stood Greg, the afternoon clerk. Greg was a middle-aged man with a gruff demeanor and a permanent scowl etched into his face. Though he prided himself on being a longtime local, his attitude often left a bitter taste in customers' mouths. For Greg, the diner was more than just a workplace. It was a place where he believed people should know their place. He had little patience for outsiders, and his disdain for certain groups of people was no secret. That afternoon, as the bell above the diner's door jingled, Lisa Moore and her son Kevin walked in. Lisa was a black woman in her late 40s, her kind face framed by glasses and a neatly tied headscarf. She wore a simple summer dress and carried a small purse. Beside her, Kevin, a tall and confident man in his 20s, held the door open for her. Lisa had always been a hard-working, compassionate woman. She'd spent years juggling multiple jobs to support her family, teaching her children the value of perseverance and kindness. Kevin, her youngest son, had inherited her resilience and determination, growing into a successful and thoughtful man. The pair had been driving back from a family reunion in the next state and decided to stop at Mel's Diner for a quick bite. Lisa, who had grown up in the South, was no stranger to places like this. She had seen her fair share of judgmental looks and microaggressions in her life, but she always kept her head high. As they stepped inside, Kevin took in the cozy yet dated atmosphere, the faded red booths and checkered floor tiles, reminiscent of a bygone era. "It's cute," he said with a smile, nudging his mom playfully. Lisa chuckled. "Let's hope the food is as good as it smells." They made their way to the counter, where Greg was leaning against the register, flipping through a magazine. "Excuse me," Lisa said politely, her warm smile unwavering. "Could we get 2 menus, please?" Greg didn't look up at first, pretending not to hear her. When he finally did, his eyes swept over Lisa and Kevin with a look that could only be described as disdain. "We're kinda busy," Greg said flatly, even though the diner was far from full. "You might want to try somewhere else." Lisa blinked, taken aback by his tone. "We don't mind waiting," she said gently. "We're just passing through and thought we'd grab a quick meal." Greg let out a sigh, loud and exaggerated. "Like I said, we're busy. Maybe you should try the place down the road." Kevin, sensing the tension, stepped forward. "Is there a reason you won't serve us?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Greg shrugged, his scowl deepening. "We've got regulars to take care of. Don't have time for extras." Lisa's smile faltered slightly, but she remained composed. "We're paying customers, just like anyone else here. she said. Greg leaned forward, his tone dripping with condescension. Look, lady, I don't make the rules, all right? You're free to go somewhere else where you'll feel more comfortable. Kevin's jaw tightened, but he placed a hand on his mother's shoulder to reassure her. Mom, why don't you grab a seat in the car? I'll handle this. Lisa hesitated, her eyes scanning the room. She could feel the weight of other diners' stares, some avoiding eye contact while others looked on with quiet sympathy. Reluctantly, she nodded and stepped outside, leaving Kevin to deal with Greg. Kevin turned back to Greg, his calm demeanor unwavering. You know, he began, I've seen people like you before. You think you can judge people by how they look, and you think you're better than them because you're standing on the other side of the counter. Greg scoffed. What do you want? A lecture? Look, I don't have time for this. Kevin smiled faintly, though his eyes were sharp. Actually, you might want to make time. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, tapping the screen a few times. Because in about 5 minutes, you're going to have a very different opinion of me. Greg raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. Oh yeah? And why's that? Kevin didn't answer. Instead, he leaned casually against the counter, his expression calm and confident. A few minutes later, the bell above the door jingled again, and a tall man in a crisp suit walked in. His presence immediately commanded attention, and several employees stopped what they were doing to greet him respectfully. Mr. Moore, one of the waitresses exclaimed, we weren't expecting you today. Greg's head snapped up, his confusion turning to alarm as he watched the man walk straight over to Kevin and shake his hand warmly. Kevin, good to see you, the man said. Good to see you too, Mr. Daniels, Kevin replied. Thanks for coming so quickly. Greg's face turned pale. Wait, what's going on? He stammered. Kevin turned to Greg, his smile now cold. Mr. Daniels here is the regional manager of this diner chain, and I, he said, pulling a business card from his wallet and sliding it across the counter, am the owner. Greg's eyes widened as he read the card, his hands shaking. You own this place? That's right, Kevin said, his tone firm. And I just witnessed how you treat customers, how you treated my mother. Greg's face turned beet red as he stared at Kevin's business card, his hands trembling. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead, and his scowl was quickly replaced with a look of panic. He stammered, I didn't know who you were. I mean, if I had known. Kevin raised an eyebrow, his expression calm but piercing. Does it really matter who I am? You didn't know who my mother was either, but that didn't stop you from disrespecting her. Is that how you treat customers when you think no one's watching? The words hit Greg like a punch. He glanced around nervously, noticing that the entire diner had gone quiet. Other employees and customers were now watching the exchange unfold, their expressions ranging from curiosity to quiet satisfaction. I didn't mean anything by it, Greg muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. It was a misunderstanding. Kevin's gaze hardened. No, Greg, it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was prejudice. You didn't serve my mother because of how she looks, and you made it very clear she didn't belong. Greg opened his mouth to argue, but Kevin cut him off. Let me ask you something, he said, leaning slightly closer. If my mother had been someone you considered important, would you have treated her differently? Or is this just how you treat anyone who doesn't fit your narrow idea of who deserves respect? Greg's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He was cornered, and he knew it. Kevin straightened up and looked over at Mr. Daniels, the regional manager. How long has Greg been working here? He asked. Mr. Daniels shifted uncomfortably. About 6 years, he replied. We've had a few complaints about his behavior before, but nothing this blatant. Kevin nodded, his expression thoughtful. Well, I think we've reached a breaking point. He turned back to Greg, his tone stern but calm. Greg, I believe in giving people chances, but when those chances are abused, there have to be consequences. Effective immediately. You're terminated. The color drained from Greg's face. Wait, what? He exclaimed, his voice rising in desperation. You can't just fire me. Yes, I can, Kevin replied firmly. And I just did. Discrimination has no place in this diner, or in any of the businesses I own. Greg stumbled over his words, but Kevin didn't give him the chance to argue further. He turned to one of the waitresses, a young woman who had been watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. Could you please escort him out? Kevin asked politely. The waitress nodded eagerly, clearly relieved to see Greg face accountability. Absolutely, she said, stepping forward. Greg glared at Kevin one last time before grabbing his belongings and storming out of the diner. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving a tense silence in his wake. Kevin turned back to the remaining staff and customers, his expression softening. I want to apologize to everyone who had to witness that, he said. This isn't the kind of environment I want to foster in my businesses. Everyone, regardless of their background, deserves to be treated with respect and dignity. The employees nodded, some even clapping quietly in support. A few customers murmured their agreement, the tension in the room beginning to dissipate. Kevin smiled faintly and added, Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to bring my mom back inside so we can finally enjoy a meal. Kevin stepped outside, where Lisa was sitting in the car, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked up as he approached, her eyes filled with concern. Is everything okay? She asked. Kevin opened the car door and smiled. It's better than okay, Mom. Let's go eat. Lisa hesitated. Are you sure? I don't want to cause any more trouble. You didn't cause trouble, Kevin reassured her. And trust me, the troublemaker is gone. This place is ours now. Lisa frowned in confusion as Kevin led her back inside. But as they entered the diner, the staff and remaining customers greeted them warmly, a stark contrast to the icy reception they'd received earlier. One of the waitresses approached with a pair of menus and a beaming smile. Welcome, Mr. Moore, Mrs. Moore, she said. Your table is ready. Please let us know if there's anything you need. Lisa's eyes widened as she turned to Kevin. What's going on? She whispered. Kevin grinned. Mom, I forgot to mention something earlier. I own this diner. For a moment, Lisa was speechless. Then she laughed, shaking her head in disbelief. You're full of surprises, Kevin. As they sat down to eat, Lisa looked around the diner, her expression thoughtful. You handled that well, she said softly. You didn't just stand up for me. You stood up for everyone who's ever been treated unfairly. Kevin shrugged modestly. You taught me to do the right thing, no matter how hard it is. I just hope Greg learned something from this too. By the time they finished their meal, the diner felt like a different place, a place filled with warmth, respect, and hope for a better future. Greg thought he could judge people by their appearance, but his arrogance cost him his job and taught him a valuable lesson about kindness and respect. This story reminds us all of the importance of standing up to discrimination and holding people accountable for their actions. Let it inspire you to treat everyone with dignity, because you never know someone's story or the power they hold. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Stories Unfolded. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And remember, the way we treat others defines who we truly are.